pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Johanna Dwyer, whose talk is entitled, Do Adult Multivitamin Mineral Supplements Fill Critical Nutrient Gaps? We're so happy to have Dr. Dwyer here as NNDC keynote speaker again after her fantastic talk on supplements at the 41st NNDC. Johanna holds several distinguished positions, and I strongly encourage you to read her full biography in the program booklet. I'll just say in the interest of time that the hat she's wearing today is the hat of senior nutrition scientist in the NIH Office of Dietary Supplements, or ODS, where she's responsible for developing databases for dietary supplements. She also collaborates in analyses of national survey data in developing screening measures for dietary supplement use and various other measures, and in studying bioactive substances, especially flavonoids and their possible roles in chronic disease. Again, I encourage you to read Johanna's full biography in the program booklet, as she's had a pretty interesting and full career and has had a strong impact on nutrition and health policy in the US. A reminder, please enter your questions for Johanna into the Q&A box. And now a warm welcome to Johanna.
Good morning. I'm Johanna Dwyer, and I'm going to be talking about multivitamin mineral supplement contents and whether they fill critical micronutrient gaps. Before I start, I wanted to show our disclosures and also to thank Rubenka over at Apt Associates, who's helped us a lot in analyses of these very large data sets. With that, let me get started and just outline 5 things I'd like to talk about. First of all, why multivitamin mineral supplements are important, and I'll just call them supplements many times, but that's what I'm referring to. The questions we have about them, a couple of toolkits that involve databases that we've used to answer some of those questions, the findings we've going to report a little of today, and finally, some implications. About 2/3 of American adults take dietary supplements. Of them, about 1/3 of adults take multivitamin mineral supplements. Now, these are important for a number of reasons. The first is that they're the most popular of all dietary supplements. They also make a positive contribution to total micronutrient intakes, and I'll try to show you that in a moment with some additional slides. They also help some users to reach the RDA for some nutrients. However, their role when we get to the whole issue of chronic disease prevention or decreasing risk is much more unclear. And the implications that these vitamin mineral supplements have for dietary guidelines and federal reimbursement is really quite considerable, and therefore I'd like to spend the last part of my talk just briefly talking about that. Well, just back to the gaps, first of all, and why these products are important. We all know that gaps exist between food intakes and requirements in some cases, particularly for vitamins D and E, magnesium, potassium, and calcium, among others. This slide is an interesting one. It's from Jeff Bloomberg at Tufts. And what he and his colleagues did was to look at the prevalence of inadequacy. That is the percent of the population below the estimated average requirement. And that's on the vertical axis of the slide. On the horizontal axis, you see some of the nutrients, and the food plus MVMS stands for food plus these supplements, and the gray bars stand for food intakes alone from one of the later Haynes studies before the pandemic. And what you see here is the proportion of the population that fell under the estimated average requirement. That is the prevalence of inadequacy. So as the bars go down, that's a good thing. And what you see for all of those nutrients, there was a considerable contribution of dietary supplements. So multivites did decrease the prevalence of dietary inadequacy, at least for some nutrients. Now, when it comes to the whole issue of chronic disease prevention, the problem there is quite different. And here's a recent review, but there have been many. There doesn't seem to be much clear evidence that that multivites reduce chronic disease risk. The studies bounce around, but when we do meta-analyses and look at all of the data, I think that's a fair statement. Here's one from a couple of years ago on hypertension risk, and what you see there is that the line of identity for all the studies together didn't show a clear favorable result from use of the products. And here is another bigger meta-analysis that included coronary heart disease as well as cardiovascular disease incidence and mortality, and also stroke incidence and mortality. And what you see there again is no clear evidence of benefit. Again, a lot of back and forth, but in the end, when we look at all the studies together, it doesn't look like there's much there. The latest big study that I've seen lately has been the Cosmos study, and that showed a few effects on multivitamin mineral supplements on cardiovascular disease in the big study that just was published, where it was led by Howard Cecil from Harvard School of Public Health. Here's cardiovascular disease. That was their secondary outcome, not their primary outcome. But again, this was a composite endpoint, and what you see there is that for all of the individual problems, there wasn't, again, much effect. They also looked at cancers in that study, and that was their primary outcome variable. And after 4 or 5 years of follow-up, there didn't seem to be a significant difference between those who took the supplement and those who did not. So these are all good studies, and they leave, I think the bottom line is there are some effects, but not on chronic disease risk, at least for those diseases. So what's in these products? What's in the multivites? What's in the bottle, and is it on the label? We also wanted to know what was in them in terms of which vitamins and which minerals. There isn't a standard of identity, so these products can be highly variable. We wanted to know how the supplements compared to shortfalls in food intakes as defined by the dietary guidelines for Americans, whether the content filled those micronutrient shortfalls in intakes, and also whether the content might be a little overboard. And finally, there's some implications I want to talk about at the very end for dietary guidelines, and perhaps also for SNAP, the big food stamp program. Let's talk first about what we know about the label versus chemical analysis, because this is where I first got into this topic of interest for myself. It's unclear if what the nutrients labeled on the label are what's in the bottle, or at least there wasn't published data that showed that this was the case. FDA probably had some, but it wasn't in the peer-reviewed literature. So we wanted to know about this, and we also know that the contents of these supplements often contain other ingredients as well, and we didn't want to do chemical analyses for them as well because it would have been very expensive. So what we did was focus on the chemical analyses of a representative sample of products through all the different channels that these products go through, and focused only on the micronutrients to see whether the contents upon label, the contents chemically were the same as what's on the label. So this brings me to the first quote toolkit. This is a toolkit that was developed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture called the Dietary Supplement Ingredient Database, and it started when Joanne Holden was still alive, and she helped us a lot. We supplied the money and they did all of the work over at USDA. Here is what the database looks like now. It emphasizes again how complicated this project became, because we've now got a whole bunch of other databases, not just the dietary supplement multivites in it. But what this database has in it is analytically validated mean estimates for about 21 nutrients in a representative sample of adult multivitamin mineral products on the market, and also multivitamins for children and prenatal, non-prescription prenatals have also been analyzed, and they're in separate databases. So we're very proud of this. The other spin-off of this has been that we've gotten into some performance testing, because the matrices of these supplements are very different than those in food, and therefore you can't just use the food matrices and the chemical analyses for that to test dietary supplements. So there's been a lot of analytical work over there led by Karen Andrews and Jim Harnley and Pamela Pearson and Pavel Gusov, trying to get to the bottom of all of this business of analytical methods specifically for dietary supplements. Now we've ended up with a whole bunch of different databases, as well as the ones we'll talk about today. We're doing omega-3s, green tea, and calcium and vitamin D, all very popular supplements as well. There are 4 studies now on botanicals. The performance tests of capsules and tablets now are up to 6 studies where we're looking at dissolution and disintegration of these products, because obviously if they don't dissolve and disintegrate, it's unlikely that they're going to become absorbed and bioavailable to the systemic circulation. And we've also collaborated with our USDA colleagues who've done most of the hard work on accuracy of voluntary labeling for some of the constituents, like the catechins and the flavonoids in these products, to see how they stack up in terms of ingredients. Now, what's special about this database? There are a lot of things, but the 2 I'd like to emphasize are, first of all, that for policy purposes, it's very helpful for analyzing overage and potential risks of excess in exposures to certain nutrients. It also provides means and variability among the various lots, so you get some idea of how variable these products are. There are a lot of other advantages as well. It links to a number of other databases and consumer resources, for example. And then I think it's very important to point out the product label improvement issues that it raises, particularly standardized label information in constructing databases is going to be necessary for bioactives like ECGC, catechins, caffeine, and so forth. If we're going to get into those databases, this is a must. Now, these data I'm presenting, but the work was done at USDA, and I want to give credit to the team over there who were kind enough to supply these data. This just shows the analyses of vitamins in adult multivitamins, mineral supplements, and they're generally above label claims, but let me explain what it says in greater detail. Most of the vitamins had an analytical content that were above label claims, and what the graph shows is the mean % difference from label for the vitamins in the adult multivites. This was multivitamin 2 study. We've had to do a couple because they constantly change. Only thiamine in
in that study was below label claim. Niacin, vitamin C, vitamin B6, and E were within about 10%. Riboflavin and vitamin A were about 10 to 20% above label, and B12 and D averaged close to 30 and 40% above label, respectively. So for all of those ingredients, in general, the trend was upward. Now, FDA requires the content to be above label claim. USP guidelines for the water-soluble vitamins, at least, are that they should be between about -10 of label and 50% above label to give some allowance for deterioration over time and so forth. And for iodine, the USP standards, I think, are about -10 to up to 65%. So the bottom line there was good news. When we look at, these are just the minerals, magnesium, iron, potassium, zinc, manganese, and copper all averaged within about 10% of label claims. If you look at calcium and phosphorus, they were slightly more than 10%. And iodine, chromium, and selenium were approximately 20% above label on average. So in summary, if you look at those vitamins and minerals from the standpoint of chemical analyses of a representative sample, overages were found in almost all of the ingredients. The only one that was a little low was thiamine. They averaged about 15%, my colleagues at USDA tell me, for vitamin A, D, folic acid, iodine, chromium, selenium, and thiamine. It was the only one that was a little below label claim. Ingredient-specific relationships were also apparent, and some of these have been reported upon elsewhere by my USDA colleagues. And when we get into some of the other supplement databases, like the prenatals, the mean overages and variability are more like adult multivitamins that I'm showing you than non-prescription prenatals. So the prescriptions are a little different. Well, the bottom line on all of that is that micronutrients in the multivites were usually above and label claims, and they always met label claims. Other bioactives, like the botanicals, I think would tell a different story from what we've done on some of the botanical supplement tablets and so forth. But that's for another talk. Okay, well, we talked about the chemical analyses. Now I'd like to focus on what micronutrients are in the multivites, how many, and whether the minerals and vitamins are those missing in dietary intakes, because those are our other questions. And to answer them, we turn to labels and focused on the dietary supplement label database, which here's the symbol for it, and it's basically a supplement telephone book that's on wheels, just as the dietary supplement ingredient database has a lot of additional functions than just a flat database. So does this. It has downloadable images. It's got virtually all the information that's on the label, including the disclaimers and claims and warnings. It's got calculators, just as the DSID does. It also has interfaces that capture and sort the information very quickly, and you can link it to Hanes supplements, to the dietary supplement ingredient databases, and to other resources we have at the Office of Dietary Supplements. I should also add that this can be done for DSID, which is a great benefit for researchers. Now, here's the labels. It's a huge number of labels now. It's more than is on this slide. We're up around 140,000 labels now. And we thought at the beginning we'd have about maybe 80,000 labels and we'd be done with the whole thing. Well, it's turning out that it's much more because we constantly are adding new labels and taking old labels that are off the market and putting them into the off the market category. So it's big data. Here's just an example of a label and all of the different things. This is a slide from Leela Saldana, who's one of my colleagues on this talk. And you see that all of these are searchable fields that you can really get a lot of information in. So let's go on and talk now about what's in the multivitamins according to the label, which vitamins, which minerals. For this, we turn to our dietary supplement label database and identified all the products that were on the market in 2019 that contained 3 vitamins, at least 3 vitamins, plus at least 1 mineral, and botanicals could either be present or not present. And that's one definition. The reason we chose that definition, again, it's not the legal definition, it's just a definition, is because that's what National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey uses in its surveys. And so it aligns well with what you would see in Hanes. And we took all of the supplements in the category 4 years and older, which is what would be defined as adult multivites. Then the work really started because we really had to clean up these labels in a lot of different ways. Sometimes there was missing information. Remember, we were doing this in 2019, so at that point, there were still the old supplement facts labels and then the new supplement facts labels, and they each had different DVs. And so when we got to the point where we needed to convert what was recommended on the label in terms of how many pills or tablets you were to take to percent DV per day, which is the way we wanted to express it to relate it to nutrient requirements, it involved a whole bunch of conversion factors and so forth for many of the labels. And therefore, we needed to use artificial intelligence to help us. And the final expression was in percent DV per day for whatever the manufacturer recommended as the serving, or servings recommended. Often it was more than one pill. So here's what it looked like, an elaborate scheme where we sorted through all of the labels and finally came out to a bottom of about 6,100 labels. Let me show you this, though, in a better way. Here we have the analytical sample of multivites for people 4 years and older that were on the market in 2019. I'll come back why we did it in 2019 in a minute. The dietary supplements on the market per se over 4 years was about 54,000. When we looked at the multivitamin mineral supplements by the Hanes definition, it sorted down to about 6,100, 6,200 labels. And that's what our analytical sample was. So these comparisons that I'm going to be showing you on the tables that come up in the next few slides are simply the number of products that had each of these various nutrients in them. And this slide shows the micronutrients in these multivitamins, mineral supplements that were on the market for these adult multivites using that Hanes definition. And what you see there is the array with the ingredients at the top being the most common. And so you see the very top one, I think, is vitamin C, and you see that one clearly was in almost all the products. And the same would go for some of the other B vitamins that are way up at the top. Now, if we looked at just the sheer number of vitamins and minerals, that's shown in this slide, and it ended up being around 6 minerals and about 9 vitamins for a total of about 15 multivitamins and minerals in those supplements on average. And there was a lot of variability around that, and there was also a lot of variability, as I showed you in the previous slide, about which nutrients were in there. And we're continuing the analyses on those topics right now. So let's go a little further on this question, because what we wanted to also know was whether the vitamins and minerals that were low in diets in population-based studies were the ones that were there. And to do that, we turned to the dietary guidelines for 2015, which were the ones in force, if you will, in 2019. And then we also looked at the 2020 guidelines. And so in both of those, there was public health concern about vitamin D, calcium, and potassium. And there was also concern about underconsumption, mostly derived from work looking at Haynes studies, in some life stages at least, or of concern, which is the term that was used in the guidelines in 2020, for vitamins A, C, D, E, folate, magnesium, iron, and choline. So that's where we came out in terms of the content. So we looked first at the nutrients of public health significance, and then secondly at the micronutrients of concern. And we wanted to know whether these would be in line with the dietary guidelines assessments of micronutrients falling short in American diets from Haynes. Okay, now the next slides are a little complicated, so let me just give you a key. So the hierarchy of concern, if you will, at least as I interpret it, in the dietary guidelines, was the public health concern was D, calcium, potassium. Shortfall or of concern, as they phrased it, were vitamins C, E, folate, magnesium, choline, and iron. And then all the other nutrients were also analyzed for. And so we'll show you the colors to signify those categories. Now, what I would expect is that the blues would be at the top because those were of highest public health concern. So you'd expect that most of those supplementing the diet, you would expect the public health concern ones to be in there, all other things being equal. I know that tablets can't be so big that you can't eat them or swallow them and so forth. But basically what we found was that the nutrients of public health concern were not the most commonly present nutrients. And then we looked at the oranges, which were the nutrients of concern, but not public health concern, of lesser concern, if you will. And again, you'd expect them to be way up toward the top because to supplement the diet, you would want to put them in. And again, some were, some weren't. There are many reasons for this, I know, but that's how the analysis came out. And then the other nutrients that were not singled out are in green, and you see that they're sort of sprinkled throughout those 6,200 products. So, okay, that's one of the things we looked at, but the other thing we looked at was whether multivitamin mineral products contain micronutrients that the dietary, we looked at all of that, but that was only one part of it. There's also this issue about concerns about potential for excess of certain nutrients, the amounts that might cause concern about excess. And for that, what we took was we looked at a whole bunch of different books and articles about nutrients of concern, and there are a lot of differences, but three that came out very commonly were folic acid, zinc in very large amounts, and also retinol. And so concern about excess, we used the upper levels for those nutrients specifically to single them out for taking a look at the products from that standpoint. And so again, I would think that for products supplementing the diet, you would want those nutrients to be in amounts that were well below the UL in a supplement. You wouldn't want them at the very top. It turns out that in the nutrients that satisfied the Haynes definition, the products tended to have a fair amount of those products had those nutrients in them. The question is what the levels were, and the levels varied all over the map. I'll come back to that in a moment. But getting back to the nutrients of public health concern from the dietary guidelines standpoint, I think it's fair to say that many contain vitamin D, and many contain C, E, A, and folate. And they also contain some of the minerals, but at much lower amounts, as expressed as percent DV. And only a few had potassium and chloride, chloride, and if choline, sorry, and if they did, they were in much lower amounts. So, in summary, if we go back to the slide where we talked about the whole issue of multivitamin contents, I think I'd have to modify that question we asked in the title slide. The multivitamin mineral supplements were very heterogeneous with wide variations in vitamins and minerals that they contain, also in the amounts, and often they also had botanicals and other bioactives that were in them as well. The products didn't provide all the micronutrients that the dietary guidelines identified as shortfalls in food intakes. They did help to fill some gaps, particularly vitamin D and E, only a little for calcium and magnesium and potassium, and they provided lots of some vitamins and minerals that were already adequate in dietary intakes. So the other thing that wasn't in the dietary guidelines, but that I think was also of concern, was that some provided very high amounts of nutrients from dietary supplements alone. And sometimes these were 100% or even above the upper levels. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about another kind of analysis that we did next. And that's about the SNAP program. The SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It used to be called the Food Stamps Program, and it's got about 41 million low-income participants in the United States today. This is a lot. Back in, I think it was 2019, let me just mention, it's food alone. That's the only thing that you can buy with SNAP benefits. But a bill was introduced that would allow the SNAP program to be used to purchase multivitamin mineral supplements for home consumption that specifically provided at least half of the vitamins and minerals for which the National Academy had established dietary reference intakes. And they had to be at 50% or more of the daily value for the life stage, in this case, adults, as determined by the Food and Drug Administration. And they couldn't exceed the upper levels for those nutrients for which there was an established upper level, and there are several that haven't. So the bill really amended that whole definition of what would be allowed. And here's just one thing from a trade association publication about the introduction of that bill back in 2019. Now the question is what the framers of that bill knew about what was in these dietary supplements. And so we asked whether the vitamins and mineral supplements that were proposed for SNAP rebates had special public health benefits. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. And this became of some policy interest because the Farm Bill in the House in 2019 included access to multivitamins for SNAP. So here's the analysis sample that we used for looking at that. What we did was we just took the subgroup within the NHANES group that also they had these additional constraints that I just mentioned on them, and looked at what they contain. And what you see here, first of all, is one thing, and that is, as you might expect, they had more nutrients. They had 6 versus about a little less than 6, or a tiny advantage over in the minerals, a big advantage over in the vitamins with 11 versus 9, and a total of about 18 versus about 15. So the SNAP potentially eligible nutrients would have more of some of the vitamins and minerals in them. And then the question is, well, what did they have in them? And again, going back to that pyramid that I showed you at the beginning, what about the blues? Well, the blues were pretty far down in the list. Out of the 1926 products that qualified, there were only about 1,100, I think, or so that had the even one vitamin D. Very few had the other 2 nutrients of public health concern. When it came to those of concern that the dietary guidelines had singled out, again, they weren't at the very top, but they were in a fair number of products for things like vitamin C. And then for the reds, in those products, there were none that went over the upper level for the products, particularly of public health concern. None of them exceeded the upper level. So in that sense, that was a real benefit. Now, if we look further at the composition of micronutrients that met the Haynes definitions versus the SNAP definitions, you see the differences are not terrifically, there isn't really a heck of a lot of difference. I guess the biggest difference would be in calcium. And so the question becomes, what brands did these products contain? And it turned out that this is the SNAP products by brand. That some companies didn't really have very many products, and one company way at the top had a lot. So the bottom line on all of this is that the products proposed for SNAP reimbursement really didn't exceed the UL, and I think that's a very good thing. They had more vitamins and slightly more minerals and a higher percent DV by definition, because they said 50%. The vitamins and minerals weren't necessarily those, however, that the dietary guidelines regarded as of concern, and many were already adequate in foods. So if you thought you were taking a pill and you were getting everything as your insurance policy, that wasn't necessarily the case. And some of the SNAP products, even though they didn't exceed the UL, they still had 100% sometimes, or even more of the DV per day in the pills. And therefore, that's before you even add food at all. So the implications of all of this are that the multivitamin mineral contents that are on the market today may be quite different. And therefore, I think it's important to do an updated analysis. The first thing that's different is that we have a new supplement facts label, and it's possible that formulations have occurred that we don't know about. It's also possible that a new SNAP bill with different criteria will be introduced in the 118th Congress that starts in January of next year. The other thing that I think is important is whether recommendations by professional groups on multivitamin content ranges for different ingredients, in different vitamin and mineral ingredients that better meet gaps might lead to better product formulations that come closer to filling gaps in nutrient needs from food alone. Now, I recognize this is very difficult because some of the nutrients, such as the minerals, are bulky, and it's very hard to get them into a capsule that would be of reasonable size. But it might be useful to consider the gaps in intakes in Hanes, and then the percent DV that might be appropriate, or the range of DVs that might be appropriate for recommended amounts of each ingredient in the multivites that would be needed to supplement food intake, just to give some basic ideas. The other way, of course, is to just recommend individual nutrients, and many people in their practices probably do that. But this is just an option to explore. So in the end, I think we need recommended ranges on ingredient amounts in the multivites to better meet intake gaps. Just to conclude with a couple of major things that I hope you take away. The first is that dietary exposure assessment, we just can't continue to ignore supplement in those assessment processes. Secondly, I think that the tools DSLD and DSID do have policy analysis utility, and that everybody, not only consumers but also those of us who are professionals, should read the supplement facts labels for all of the supplements. You'd be surprised at what's in some of them. And finally, just a note that databases, since this is a database conference, beyond nutrients, of these dietary ingredients other than nutrients that are in dietary supplements, it's going to be very hard to do databases of them without more standardization of ingredient descriptions, because they're all over the map right today. So thank you so much for your time. I'll be happy to answer any questions I can, and thank you to all of the organizers for what's always a good meeting, but this one is really exceptional. Thanks so much, and look forward to your questions.